Most people spend their entire lives assuming the brain is, in essence, well understood. A wet, gray mass of biological tissue that fires electrical pulses between neurons, processes signals received from the senses, and produces thought. This idea has the comfort of being simple, and because it is simple, almost nobody ever questions it. The problem is that it has never managed to explain how the brain actually works, not the brain as an anatomical organ, not the list of regions that a neuroimager displays in vivid color after you solve a memory exercise. The problem is the mechanism, the actual speed at which you recognize a face in a crowd. The moment a difficult decision about a job or a relationship or a shift in the direction of your life simply resolves inside your mind without your being able to describe the process. The intuition that arrived before you had time to think. For any of these events to occur inside a three-dimensional, linear processing system operating through electrical pulses that travel point to point across sequential synapses, the brain would need to execute a volume of computation far beyond what the biological matter available inside a human skull can physically perform. The numbers do not close. For more than a century, this was treated as an instrumentation problem. The premise was that our microscopes were not powerful enough, that our temporal resolution was inadequate, that once we built the right tools, the mechanical circuit of thought would finally appear on the neurological map. In 2017, a team of researchers decided to stop searching for the circuit. They asked something different. The geometry being used to describe the brain might be fundamentally wrong. The Blue Brain Project is an international research consortium based at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne. Since its founding, the project's stated goal had been to create the first high-fidelity digital simulation of human neural tissue, not a schematic. A detailed reconstruction, cell by cell, of how real neurons organize, connect, and activate in the neocortex. But in 2017, the neuroscientist Henry Markram, who led the project, made a methodological decision that would change what they found. He brought in a mathematician named Catherine Hess, a specialist in a field called algebraic topology. Algebraic topology is not physics. It is not neuroscience. It is a branch of pure mathematics that studies the fundamental geometric shape of networks and spaces, independent of their physical size, weight, or substance. To an algebraic topologist, what matters is not the length of a synapse or the thickness of an axon. What matters is the connectivity structure, the geometric shape that emerges when you map which elements are linked to which others, and how many dimensions are required for that shape to exist correctly. When Catherine Hess and her team applied the tools of algebraic topology to the digital reconstruction of the human neocortex, what appeared in their simulations had no precedent in biology. To understand what they found, it helps to build the geometry from the ground up, starting from something you can actually picture. Think about a single isolated neuron. In the language of topology, an isolated object with no connections is simply a point in space, 0 dimensions. Now connect that neuron to a second one through a direct synapse. Information can now flow between the two along a line, 1 dimension. Connect a third neuron to both of the first two, so that each of the three has a direct link to the other two simultaneously. The shape those 3 neurons form when you map their connections is a filled triangle, a flat surface, 2 dimensions. Add a fourth neuron, fully connected to the previous 3, and the geometry pushes out of the flat plane. You need a third dimension to represent the shape correctly. 4 fully interconnected neurons form a tetrahedron, a 4-faced pyramid. 3 dimensions. This is the limit of what human visual intuition can track. A shape that requires 4 dimensions to exist cannot be visualized, only calculated. But the brain does not stop at the 4th neuron. What the Blue Brain Project discovered is that neurons in the neocortex group themselves into fully interconnected nodes that mathematicians call cliques. And these cliques do not stop at 4 elements. The brain forms groups of 5 neurons, all directly connected to each other at the same time. 7 neurons. 9. In some instances, up to 12. Each time you add one element to a fully connected clique, the mathematical dimension of the resulting object rises by 1 degree. 5 fully connected neurons form a 4-dimensional object. 7 neurons form a 6-dimensional structure. A clique of 12 neurons generates a mathematical object that only exists in 11 dimensions. This is not speculation. It is a direct consequence of the mathematical definition of dimension, applied to the actual connectivity structure of real human neurons. The physical matter continues to occupy the three-dimensional volume inside the skull. But the information geometry that these neurons process together inhabits a mathematical structure of 11 dimensions. And what the study revealed goes beyond the presence of these structures. What genuinely unsettled the research team was what these structures create at their center. A group of fully interconnected neurons does not form a solid block. When multiple high-dimensional cliques connect with one another, they surround an empty space in the middle. In topology, these spaces have a technical name: cavities, multidimensional voids. The study found these cavities packed inside every cubic millimeter of the human neocortex in quantities difficult to fully picture. They are not imperfections or accidental gaps in the neural network. The topological analysis showed that they are structurally necessary. They are the space that holds the entire geometry together. And then came the most disquieting part of the discovery. When the researchers applied a stimulus to the simulated neural tissue, representing any form of sensory or cognitive input, the neurons did not simply fire in pairs or along linear chains. They constructed, in fractions of a second, a sequence of cliques of increasing dimension, like a geometric tower rising around a central cavity. One group of neurons fired in low dimension. That firing activated an adjacent group, which formed a clique of higher dimension. That second group activated a third, of higher dimension still. The multidimensional structure kept growing until it reached a maximum complexity of organization. And then, as soon as the stimulus passed, the entire tower collapsed. The geometry dissolved. The neurons returned to a resting state, and the brain was clear, ready to build the next geometry in the next fraction of a second. Markram described the process this way: the brain constructs and destroys these multidimensional structures across the entire duration of conscious experience, like sandcastles built and erased in milliseconds. Every thought, every perception, every memory accessed is a high-dimensional geometric structure that emerges from the void and returns to it. This raises a question without an easy answer. Why the void? Why is information processed not inside the solid matter of the neurons, but in the cavity they surround? Consider how a Gothic cathedral was built. A 12th century architect did not stack stones randomly until a large building appeared. He calculated exactly where to place each column, each flying buttress, each pinnacle, not to celebrate the solidity of stone, but to create the largest possible empty interior space. The real value of the cathedral is not in the weight of its material. It is the hollow space that material holds open. It is inside the void that the sound of a choir resonates with perfect acoustics. It is inside the void that light passes through the colored glass and produces the visual experience that turns cold stone into something that generates the sensation of presence. Centuries of labor by medieval stonecutters existed to give form to a space that is made of no stone at all. The blue brain discovery suggests the human brain operates according to the same architectural principle. The neurons hold the structure up, and the processing happens in the cavity. But this creates a problem that has to be answered. If the processing happens in geometries of 11 dimensions, why does conscious experience of the world feel so strictly three-dimensional? You do not walk through your day perceiving 8 additional dimensions of information. So where do they go? Physics has a name for this mechanism: dimensional projection. Imagine a completely flat universe, an infinite sheet of paper inhabited by beings who perceive only length and width. They have mathematics, they have physics, they have philosophy. But none of the categories in their thinking include the possibility of a third dimension. For them, reality is, by definition, two-dimensional. Now take a three-dimensional sphere and slowly push it through that flat paper. What do the inhabitants of the sheet observe? Not a sphere. They could never see a sphere. What appears within their perceptual field is a point that emerges from nowhere, grows into a circle, expands to a maximum diameter, and then shrinks back until it vanishes. They can measure this event with perfect scientific precision. They can track its rate of growth, calculate the moment it will disappear, and everything they capture is one slice, a compressed shadow of an object that lives in a dimension their senses were not built to detect. The experience is real. The object being perceived is incomplete. Everyday conscious experience may be operating on the same principle. The three-dimensional world you navigate could be the projected shadow of an information processing geometry that exists in up to 11 mathematical dimensions. You do not access the higher dimensions of that geometry directly, for the same reason that the inhabitants of the flat universe cannot see the complete sphere. You access its shadow, the version translated into the space that your senses can represent. There is a moment in this that stops being comfortable. Most people who have thought about this, really thought about it, have noticed a specific asymmetry. What the brain appears to process and what consciousness reports as a result are not the same scale of complexity. You have likely had the experience of being unable to make a decision for weeks. You weigh the options, analyze the data, write out the lists, nothing resolves, and then one day, while doing something entirely unrelated to the problem, washing dishes, walking somewhere familiar, the answer arrives, complete and clear. Not as the product of a calculation you followed step by step, as something that showed up. Within a linear three-dimensional computation model, this has no satisfying mechanical explanation. If thought were literally a sequence of electrical impulses happening in a fixed order, you should be able to follow the reasoning in real time, the way a computer executes a list of instructions in sequence. You cannot. Most of what the brain does never surfaces as conscious experience at all. The computation happens, the output arrives, and the process itself is invisible. But within a multi-dimensional information processing geometry, where topological cavities allow multiple data relationships to be accessed simultaneously, the idea that processing converges in ways that linear consciousness cannot track stops being a paradox and becomes an expected consequence of the architecture. Memory consolidation offers the same pattern from a different angle. Sleep researchers have known for decades that certain types of learning do not fully solidify during the hours a person spends consciously practicing them. A musician who spends 4 hours drilling a difficult passage on the piano often performs it better the following morning than at the end of the session the night before. A student who studies a problem set before sleeping and then retakes the material after waking consistently outperforms those who stayed awake the entire time grinding through additional repetitions. The consolidation happens in the absence of conscious effort. Something processes during sleep that the waking, sequential experience of practicing cannot replicate. The standard explanation points to slow-wave sleep and REM cycles, reorganizing synaptic connections in the hippocampus. That is factually accurate at the level it describes, but it tells you which brain regions are metabolically active during the process. It does not tell you what the actual computation looks like. The where is not the how. The multidimensional geometry of the blue brain suggests a different framing. If the brain's processing structures are high-dimensional geometric towers that build and collapse around topological voids, then removing the continuous stream of sensory input during sleep may be precisely what allows the geometry to operate at its full dimensional depth, without the constraint of real-time experience demanding a moment-by-moment output. The complexity that cannot be resolved step by step in the sequential flow of conscious attention gets processed in the absence of that constraint. Not mystically, geometrically. The fact that dreams during this processing sometimes include vivid, non-linear narrative structures, combinations of memories, emotions, and sensory experiences that no sequential logic could have produced, is consistent with what you would expect from a system integrating information across multiple dimensions simultaneously rather than along a single line. Two distortions tend to follow this kind of discovery, and both are worth naming before going further. The first is dismissing it as a mathematical curiosity with no real implication. The topological structures found by the Blue Brain Project are not modeling artifacts. They were verified against in vivo neural recording data and confirmed in multiple subsequent studies. The multidimensional geometry of neural cliques is a genuine property of real nervous tissue, not a projection of the model. The second distortion is the jump in the other direction. claiming the 11 dimensions of the brain are the 11 dimensions of string theory, as physical entities inhabited by quantum fields. They are not. They are mathematical dimensions of information connectivity. That is, by itself, extraordinary enough. It does not need inflation to be significant. The data shows that the human brain organizes information processing through geometries that no simple mechanistic theory has described adequately. 20th century neuroscience tried to map thought as an electrical circuit. 21st century mathematics is revealing that the actual substrate of cerebral processing has a dimensional structure that begins precisely where our visual intuition of space ends. If something about the model of your own mind no longer fits after this, that discomfort has a name in the history of science. It appears every time a new instrument reveals that the territory is more complex than the map being used to navigate it. The map is not wrong. It is smaller than the thing it was trying to describe. If your brain's information processing operates in 11 mathematical dimensions, and if conscious experience is the three-dimensional shadow of that processing, then the question of where consciousness resides inside the brain may be being asked in the wrong dimension. Searching for consciousness inside the neurons, as if it were a property of biological matter locatable with sufficient resolution, is like the inhabitants of the flat universe searching for the complete sphere inside the circle they can observe. The circle is real. It is not the whole object. The question that frontier physics and frontier neuroscience are converging toward, without yet having an agreed answer, is whether subjective experience, the thing that it is like to be you looking at the world right now, may be a property that emerges in the dimensionality of processing, and not in the matter that sustains it. This does not solve the hard problem of consciousness. Nothing does, yet. But it changes where the answer might be searched for. And in science, knowing where to look is almost everything. For decades, neurological reductionism said, find the neural correlate of every subjective experience and consciousness will be explained. That research was not wasted. It produced functional brain maps of extremely high resolution. But each map also produced new anomalies the theory could not absorb. The experience of integrating information coherently, of persistent identity across time, of qualia, of being something from an internal point of view, kept escaping mechanical description. The multidimensional geometry of the blue brain does not resolve that alone, but it offers a new substrate, a substrate where information processing carries a dimensional complexity that mechanistic theories never needed to model, and a substrate where the void, the non-material space that the neural structure holds open, is functionally central rather than peripheral. There is a theory in contemporary consciousness science called integrated information theory. Its creator, the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, proposed that consciousness is not a location inside the brain or a product of a specific region's activity. In Tononi's framework, consciousness is a measure of how much a system integrates information in a way that cannot be decomposed into independent parts without losing something essential. He gave this measure a name, phi. A system with high phi integrates its components in such a way that the whole processes information the individual parts cannot process separately. A system with low phi is a collection of pieces that could operate independently without losing much. Tononi's claim is that any system with phi above a certain threshold is to some degree conscious, regardless of whether it is biological or not. Here is what makes this relevant to the blue brain finding. A topological cavity surrounded by interconnected high-dimensional cliques has a structural property that maps directly onto what Tononi's theory describes. The geometry that the neural cliques create around their central void cannot be decomposed into its individual clique components without losing the cavity entirely. The cavity only exists because all of the surrounding cliques are present and connected. Remove any one of them, and the geometry collapses. The void that sustained the computation disappears. This does not prove that the two frameworks are describing the same thing, but it raises the possibility that the multidimensional neural cavities discovered by algebraic topology may not just be the substrate of complex information processing. They may be the physical instantiation of exactly what Tononi's theory defines as the necessary condition for conscious experience, a structure that cannot be reduced to its parts without losing what made it function. Two independent lines of research, one from mathematics applied to neural anatomy, one from theoretical neuroscience trying to formalize consciousness, are arriving at the same architectural description: the space that cannot be seen, the void that the structure holds open, the cavity where the geometry is not. If you find this line of investigation worth following, where actual science of the mind begins to produce results that the dominant models had no room for, subscribing means the next one finds you. What is worth carrying from this investigation is not the 11 as a number. It is what the number implies, that the architecture of your brain is, measured in the terms that current mathematics can describe, of a structural complexity that classical biology never considered necessary. That the actual information processing that produces thought and perception happens in geometric cavities, not in solid matter, and that the conscious experience you call reality may be, in the most rigorous sense that topology can offer, the compressed projection of a geometry that science is only beginning to have the tools to map. Questions like where thought actually happens and where consciousness resides have not been answered by mechanical neuroscience. They have been reformulated by it. And now the mathematics is demanding a reformulation far deeper than anything the previous century considered necessary. The next layer of this has already been found, and it is more unsettling still.